Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Xiao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey guys. Today we are continuing our series on campus novels with a discussion of Philip Roth's The Human Stain. As a reminder, you can join our extended book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where you can talk with us every 2 weeks as we read these books. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. We will be revealing spoilers here, so if you don't want the ending or the middle of this book spoiled for you, check out our review episode, which was published last week. This is our penultimate episode in the series. Next week, we will have our series review, where we discuss all 3 books, which are The Human Stain, The Secret History, and Stoner. But before we do that, let's talk about characterization in this novel.
Yes, let's talk about that. This novel is heavy on characterization in these long-winded monologues to the point where I got tired of the very similar deep dive into each character's head and backstory. We already talked in the review portion about how this type of loquaciousness didn't work for us. But is every character's treatment in this way the same? For example, when we're first introduced to Les Farley's point of view in Chapter 1, that was the first time I really noticed my dislike of this style. But then we go into Coleman's childhood in Chapter 2, and how the people in his life shaped him, especially his relationships, and I really enjoyed it. I liked getting to know Coleman deeply. And almost immediately after that, returning to present day in the following chapter, I again felt encumbered by the prose. Were there parts of the book where this form worked better for you than others?
I think the reason why you enjoyed the second chapter about Coleman's childhood is because it's less descriptive and more active. I think that there are lots of things actually happening in that chapter rather than the fixation on a very limited set of events.
Sam, you said that you got tired of the deep dive into each character's head and backstory. I did not really get tired of it. I found it tedious at the start. So to say I got tired of it meant at the beginning, I liked it. But in a way, I felt the opposite. I didn't like it at the beginning, but as the book went along, I kind of fell into the rhythm of the novel, and I came to appreciate it more. So I did think it was tiresome, but I sort of gained an appreciation for it.
I think the problem I have with it is that it's very detailed and very overwrought, but it's not like a Victorian novel. It's not like Charles Dickens, where you have a lot of characters and a lot of things happening. You have a limited set of characters and a limited group of things happening, but it's just dissected again and again ad nauseum. I feel that there is a certain scope that's out of balance. You have the amount of things happening, and the amount of description far outweighs the amount of things happening.
But was that equal across the board for you? The stream of consciousness style of Les's rambling malevolence stemming from his PTSD felt trite to me. Not because PTSD doesn't cause such problems, but rather this style of over-the-top crazy seems all too common in fiction, especially with regard to Vietnam vets. Wouldn't it be scarier and maybe more interesting if he were more calculating, more focused? The plotting and end result could stay the same, but my concern is with how mental illness is portrayed here, and I'm wondering if I'm missing something. The only time we get a glimpse of that possibility of Les's calculation is at the very end, the last scene with Nathan, the writer, on the ice.
I think that there are two things going on that you're talking about. You're talking about the content of the way Les thinks and the way Les behaves, but then there's also the style, the way that Roth writes about Les thinking and behaving. Can we separate these two, or do you think that one directly informs the other?
I think we can separate them, but they are very closely linked. It is a stylistic thing that Roth is doing with Les, but the content is also problematic to me.
I didn't have the same reaction as you. For me, what I found really interesting, and I actually don't remember if this was earlier on or in the middle, as you said, was this question of whether or not he could actually have saved the kids. That to me is very compelling and it's very human. It's the most compelling part of his character earlier on, because if he didn't save his kids because he was blinded by rage at his wife, I think that colors his character for me in a very specific way. And I don't remember if that happened at the beginning.
It does. And that does hearken us back to what you were talking about in the review portion, where there are some details where it's a little unclear how they actually unfolded, that you kind of have to piece certain things together and make guesses for yourself.
Okay, I can say then that I didn't have the same reaction as you, mostly because on the strength of that revelation, I viewed him in a completely different way. He wasn't a stereotypical vet to me. He was someone who might be complicit in the death of his children in a very visceral way, because he actually went in, picked up his kids, then saw his wife, dropped his kids. He knew his kids were alive, and because of his rage, he could not stop himself from leaving his kids to go and fight with his wife and her lover. That to me is a very human conflict, and I thought that was super interesting.
So there's the rub, right? That is an interesting characterization. That's an interesting detail about less, but it's not about style and it's not about content per se. That's just the details that Roth is trying to give us. And I feel like that got lost among everything else.
Well, for me, it's the opposite. The way it affected me, actually, is this is such an important point in a person's life. He was directly complicit in the death of his children. But despite that, it is drowned out by everything else. That is what I find interesting. So for me, it is the fact that there's this avalanche of information. Whereas with Fanya, you get early on that she is defined by this act of allowing her kids to die. It creeps up in different places, so you never forget it, but it also is one of the first things you learn about her. So what's interesting for me is the fact that it is not the first thing you learn about less, but it should be the most important thing. That kind of hiding is what's interesting. Though I agree with you, there is a lot, and maybe it could be dialed back.
Well, I will backpedal just slightly to say that the way that's told, the murkiness of those details, by doing that, Roth sets us up for the murkiness of the car crash later. There is something about that. There is purpose to that.
I was going to say something about less, but to be honest, I feel like I don't really care as much about less as Sam does, or maybe even as much as you do, James. He is, in a sense, a stock character. He is portrayed in a way that we've seen other PTSD suffering vets portrayed. He is slightly redeemed by this event that happens that you guys have described. But even if he weren't, and to my mind, actually, he isn't, because I didn't even pay attention to that scene as carefully as you two did, it doesn't matter so much because he is in the novel in the sense to serve a certain function. He is not exactly a villain, but close to a villain. He's the source of Coleman Silk's undoing, or at least one of them. And in that sense, he does have a function to perform, and he performs it. And when he's on the periphery early in the novel, when Coleman and Fawny are dancing together and he's waiting outside of Coleman's house, he is a very threatening and menacing person. So I think it works, regardless of whether or not he's a caricature of kind of PTSD vets, is not so important to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being very crude and unfeeling, but it doesn't matter so much.
I want to back up a little bit because my original question was, were there parts where this style worked better for you than others? This deep dive into the characters. I mean, we're talking a lot about less, but what about Fania?
I think it works better for Les, actually, than for other characters. Because of his PTSD, he's prone to a certain kind of mania, which manifests in the way that the prose is so fixated on certain things. It's appropriate.
Even though I am going to sidetrack your question again, Sam, I just want to add that this focus on whether or not he actually killed his kids, one thing I think it does do is it goes toward the theme of the book. For me, one of the main themes of the book, which is shame. He is someone who's ashamed of a lot of different things, but he won't ever express it. Just like the main character, Coleman, but the question is whether or not he's ashamed of what he's done. And the answer is, of course, no. But the subtext here is he ashamed of hiding his race? Right? Like, that is the question that is never addressed head on, but it lurks throughout the novel once you find out that he's black. I think the idea of shame is one of the big ideas of this novel. So whether Les is ashamed of what he's done is a key question here. And whether he's ashamed at the end of possibly killing someone, I think is the subtext also. To that end, I think it is important because it builds up this kind of foundation. Les is someone who's ashamed. Fania is someone who's ashamed. Coleman is someone who you think is not ashamed, but he secretly probably is ashamed. And all of that works together for me.
Part of my hesitation with a lot of this is that while I want certain things to be clearer, I know that that's part of what Roth is doing, is muddying the waters, because to make those things clear would be the mark of a lesser writer.
And to expound just a little bit more, of course, you have the national shame of what Clinton did and whether or not he should actually be ashamed. And you also have Les feeling this kind of embarrassment because he views his wife as cheating on him all the time, right? He is perpetually cuckolded. And that, I think, really does get at the heart of what this novel is about for me.
How do you square his constant sense of shame with the fact that later in the novel, after he visits the miniature Vietnam War memorial, he says that he doesn't feel anything inside?
I think that his shame that he carried with him was related to not being able to save his buddy. And so he's someone who's overburdened with shame. He went to the memorial, and when he was supposed to feel some kind of release, he actually didn't feel anything. So in a way, he's kind of freed from the shame. Like, he was supposed to have some kind of catharsis, right? He's supposed to encounter and take on the shame and kind of resolve it, but he didn't get that. So he became this freed character, but also this kind of dead character. It's this question of, if you are freed from these moral ties, then you're free to do anything. If you are no longer ashamed that your buddy died, or you're no longer emotionally affected by it, then you can do anything in the world.
Right.
My reading is a little bit different from that. My reading is that he always suspected that he was dead inside. He always suspected that he couldn't engage with post-Vietnam life the way that other people could, and visiting the memorial and not having even the same reaction that his friends and his counselor had confirmed to him that he is different, and that his source of difference is that he doesn't have any feelings. It's not that that moment erased his feelings, but it was a confirmation of their absence.
There's a dissociative nature to him. And I think the thing that most of the vets, his buddies, have already experienced is that they've come to terms with that shame. They've shed that, but also they don't have that dissociative nature that he's dealing with.
This is a book that has no redemption. All the characters like Les and Coleman Silk, they never actually get any peace, which for someone like me who likes that kind of novel, it's great. But I think it's something that is not on the surface level. And we talked previously how there is not a lot of subtext. And I would argue that there is some subtext, especially when it comes to this idea of how he kind of dissects these ideas of shame, embarrassment, redemption. what a person should be doing with his life compared to what the person is actually doing with his life compared to what the public expects from you. I think that's what Philip Roth does really well here.
Well, let's talk more about that, because I think that is the source of at least my displeasure with this novel, and I think it's probably similar with Sam. The style of the novel and how much is on the page versus how much is left to the reader's mind. There is a style of writing that is dubbed maximalism, and I read an interesting description of maximalism as compared to minimalism by the author John Barth in a article, New York Times article called A Few Words About Minimalism. In that article, he explains that there is a history of both types of writing going back throughout the ages, and that they both kind of vacillate in terms of being in fashion and out of fashion. For me, I think that The Human Stain is definitely in the maximalist camp, and I think that, while it has its own beauty, all of that beauty is undercut by his apparent impulse to exhaust his subject matter, or at least his own ability to ponder the subject that he's talking about. In Barth's article, he notes several advantages of maximalism. He says that there is richness, precision in language, completeness, and complexity in terms of syntax. So what I'm wondering, if we have those criteria, if those are the advantages that we can find in maximalism, does Roth attain any of those?
I think he does, but for me, the problem is I get very quickly that he is very adept at all of those things. The problem for me is that there's no end to it.
I agree with Sam in that I think he does achieve all of it. I do not like the style personally, but I think my dislike of it is just something related to taste. It's not an objective dislike. I dislike it because I know what I like. It's a bit like going to Muscle Beach and seeing really buff dudes working out. It's not for me. I'm happy seeing that there are people who are really buff and they are at the peak of whatever they are, but it's not for me. And I can even appreciate that kind of beauty, but it's not for me. That's my problem with Roth, is I feel like he does achieve all those. He is, at the peak of his powers, a masterful writer, but it's not the style I like.
That's very fair, I think. I feel the same way.
Even without comparing the stylistic qualities that we find in this novel to their opposites, which also seem appealing, if we just kind of flip each of these characteristics, we can see the flip side is also a negative thing. So for me, the flip side of richness is tedium. The flip side of the precision that we find in this novel is something I would call a closed texture, in terms of not being open to the reader to generate his own ideas about meaning or his own ideas about even plot. Sometimes a very open novel will be very ambiguous in that way. In terms of being complete, the novel can also be overwrought, where it's not just complete, but it has more than is necessary. You have 200% of the description or 200% of the detail that's necessary. So none of these things in and of themselves is wholly a virtue in my mind. And it may just be a matter of taste, as James is saying, but I do think that there is a case that somebody could make for saying that by writing using this style, Roth has prevented himself from achieving some of the beauty that fiction can offer us. And what beauty I'm talking about here is the kind of beauty that comes from looking at a novel not as a source of meaning, but as a site where meaning can be found. And that meaning can come from the text, but the text is more of a fertile soil where meaning that comes from the reader can be planted and meaning that comes from the reader can grow. And that to me is the most valuable type of meaning that I would like to find in fiction, and it's impossible to find in this novel.
I think you're talking about two things here. You're talking about each individual element, and then you're talking about wanting to have more subtext, right? Wanting the reader to be more participatory.
Well, subtext is not necessarily participation on the reader's part, because there is subtext which is very, very heavily gestured towards by the writer. Here I'm thinking of something like Ernest Hemingway. And then there's a very, very radically open text where it's ambiguous and there isn't even a subtext gestured towards. It's just ambiguous. And that ambiguity is definitely not present in this novel. And I think either of them would be valuable. I think either of them would be part of the value of fiction that I want. The thing that I think makes fiction important to me is that it's not just a reception of meaning from a text or from an author, but a participatory and an ongoing thing where I can continue to have a relationship with a book by reading it multiple times. This is a book that I'll probably never read again. And that to me just makes it feel very dead.
I think the difficulty for me is actually the presence of Nathan Zuckerman. And I know why he is present, because this is part of Roth's greater body of work. But if you look at this as a self-contained novel, I think Nathan Zuckerman doesn't actually add that much to the novel. If he was actually removed from the novel, then I think the pacing would be improved, and a lot of the themes are actually clearer.
I wonder. I mean, I understand your qualms, but he's not in it all that much. We start with him and we end with him. And there's maybe a couple sections in the middle, but not really that much, is there?
Isn't the entire text something that we presume is known to him?
That's true. This is supposed to be his work.
Yes. It is kind of interesting from a metafictional point of view, right? Like, this is the person piecing together some kind of historiography. But for me, what this novel is investigating is, like I mentioned before, this idea of shame and this idea of reinvention, which is part of the fabric, the DNA of America. And if I may sort of wax poetic a bit, I mean, this is like the whole history of America, this idea that you can reinvent yourself, but also the idea that America is a country that's founded in shame with slavery and genocide of Native Americans. The problem, I think, is because it's so long, and for me, I don't think Zuckerman does that much in the novel, that it doesn't form a cohesive whole. And that actually detracts from the overall work.
I think that he exists in the novel for Roth, first of all, to point to the fact that, again, the same theme, that you think you know everything, but what you know is dubious. And we see him as the author of the novel, in a sense, even though he's not. But we also think that, well, how does he have access to all of this information? Because clearly he couldn't have access to everything that is described within the human stain. So clearly some sort of poetic license may have been taken.
So then, with all of my complaints about Les Farley's point of view in Chapter 1, are we supposed to take from Nathan's character that he wrote all of that? That all of that is speculation on the part of Nathan about what might be going through Les's head?
I think we might. I think it's not for sure, but I think that from Nathan's experience with Les at the end of the novel on the ice, this is what Nathan has extrapolated about what Les would be thinking.
What's interesting about that is it introduces some measure of doubt. If it's couched in one character's point of view, then there's always this doubt, well, this character is biased in some way, and so he's going to portray people in a certain way, and because of that, you can't really trust how he's portrayed everyone. The reason why I don't like Nathan is I don't think this book leans into that enough. It can be very interesting, because once again, I think this book deals with this idea of public perception and private lives. And if you have someone who's speculating what actually happened, then you can't say this person is fully credible and you can't really believe that person. But I just don't think he does enough with that. So it could be much more interesting, but I don't think it's interesting enough.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's not something that Roth highlights as much as he could have.
All right, let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about whether people will continue to read novels in the future. Welcome back. So Philip Roth died in 2018. In 2010, he said the concentration, the focus, the solitude, the silence, all the things that are required for serious reading are not within people's reach anymore. So in this, he was talking specifically about reading novels. Do you think this is true, that people are just not able to read novels anymore?
Able is a interesting way of putting it. I think he's right in that it requires a lot more concentration than it used to. But I think he's wrong that there are plenty of people reading books. There are plenty of people reading serious books. It just requires more effort to do so. There are so many things vying for our attention.
I think that he's right in the sense that a certain type of novel is perhaps on the way out. And I think it's the human stain type of novel that might be on the way out. Reading this novel requires a certain sort of stamina, a certain sort of endurance. And I think that that stamina endurance is present in human beings, but like any other test of endurance, you only know you have it when you need it. And nowadays, there are so many other things that will distract us and fill our leisure time that we'll never really need it again. We'll never really wade through these paragraphs of one sentence or these huge, huge sentences full of clause after clause describing the same thing because it's so much easier to just turn on Netflix. So something is going away, and I don't know if it's really a sad thing that it's going away, but it is an ending nonetheless.
I have a counterpoint to that of sorts. We talked about maximalism. One of the maximalists that comes to mind when I think of that is David Foster Wallace. I understand why people like him, but has never really been for me. He wrote Infinite Jest, his famous 1,000-plus page novel, in the mid-90s. But I remember about 10 years ago, it had this resurgence where, for some reason, one summer, everyone was trying to read it. Trying being the operative word. I know a lot of people failed. I did not try because I already knew I wasn't a fan. But I know a lot of people love him. I think there will be less novels like this, and I think there will be less people reading novels like this. But I don't think this is going away either.
So it's kind of a two-part question that I'm going to talk about here, right? The first question is, do I think people will read novels? I think that novels as a medium is different from a visual medium like, streaming Netflix, because a novel puts you in a different state of mind and it achieves different aims, or it can achieve different aims. There's a lot of overlap, for sure, when it comes to storytelling. But the feeling that one gets from a novel is different. So as long as you achieve that, and as long as there are people who want that kind of feeling, that experience, then people will still read novels. Though I think the share of people reading novels will shrink dramatically. The second question, I don't think that it will affect maximalism or this style of writing that much, because I don't see that as being at odds with what a novel can do that's different from what a visual medium can do. I think you are right, though, yet, that this novel is significantly more difficult to get into. But I think if we are imagining a future where people who are reading novels are specializing in reading novels in a way, because all the casual novel readers wouldn't do it, that these are people who seek out the novel because of what the novel can give them, then I feel like those people would be able to read these kinds of dense maximalist texts. So yeah, I don't think that a book like this might necessarily become extinct, though I do think the number of people who would read this kind of book would shrink dramatically. Well, now that I've given you guys all the right opinions, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit once again at Canonical Pod, where we post threads for our book club discussion every Wednesday. We would love for you to join us. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. That's Canonical Pod, one word. We will be back next week with our series wrap on campus novels. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.